Bamise sat at a corner of the tiny room she has lived for 10 years with the Bases. Hot tears ran down her face as she looked at the leftover food with the bones before her. It was her birthday, and as always, the Bases had given her a leftover meal as a reminder of what she did 8 years ago. That year, Bamise had just turned 10, and all she ever wanted was for the family to at least sing a birthday song for her like they do for their own biological daughter. As a child, she voiced out her feelings, but the Bassis did not take it lightly with her. Her foster mother, Mrs. Bassi, hit her on the face for having such effrontery, while her foster father poured her the cup of tea he was taking that morning. And from that day, her foster parent decided that she would always eat leftovers on her birthday. Now, 8 years later, Bamishi wondered why her foster parent would not forgive her despite apologizing many times. They keep giving her leftover food at every birthday, and they always do everything to make her unhappy throughout that day. As she cried, her stomach rumbled loudly, signaling that she had to eat something for the day. But after eating the little leftover on her plate, she was hungry again. She went to the kitchen and found it locked up as usual. Her foster parents and their daughter had gone for a function, and as usual, Bamishe is locked in with the kitchen under key. She sat at the entrance of the kitchen, remembering the day Mrs. Bassi decided to always keep the kitchen under lock and key. Someone had stolen 2 pieces of meat in the pot, and she was disciplined for it despite the fact that she knew nothing about it. You ungrateful child. You are not happy that you are even getting to eat my food, Mrs. Bassi said, her eyes narrowing. Do you think I'm running a charity? Why steal my meat when I feed you at least twice a day? You will be punished for this because I do not condone stealing. But Michelle tried to explain that she knew nothing about the stolen meat, but Mrs. Bassi had made up her mind. From flogging with canes to punishment and going hungry for days, Bamishi was severely punished for days for a crime she knew nothing about. Ever since that day, Mrs. Bassi would lock the kitchen door even if they are going on a trip for weeks. During these times, Bamishi would only have to survive on Gary for days. And the heartbreaking thing is that she is often locked in the home until the family gets back, so she cannot go outside to ask for help. That night, as Bamishi laid on a mat, her stomach rumbled painfully as she rolled from one end of the mat to the other. There were beds in the house, but Bamishe is not allowed to sleep on them. Rachel have a large, comfortable one in a room, and there were even 2 guest rooms with perfectly made beds, but Bamishe was never allowed to sleep in them. The cold floor became her only refuge, without any blanket to keep her warm. This routine of neglect and cruelty had continued year after year. Bamishi was never given enough food, and when she was fed, it was always Rachel's leftovers, cold, tasteless scraps that Rachel did not want. Also, she was not allowed to eat with the family. Mrs. Bassi would scold her for everything, often accusing her of things she hadn't done. If Rachel got into trouble, it was always Bamishi who took the blame. Rachel became just as cruel. She is aware of her mother's favoritism, and she saw Bamishi as nothing more than a servant, and she often mocked her, saying, "You are even lucky to be here. My mom says no one wants you." Bamishi cried for hours, feeling like a burden and unwanted by the people she so much loved and adored. She remembered when she got to the Bass's household. She was just 8 years old, and her mother had died in childbirth. Her father, who could not bear the loss of his dear wife, had succumbed to a long illness, and her relatives were either too poor or too distant to care for her. She was placed in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Bassi by her mother's younger sister, who has 6 children of her own. She had told Badmiche that feeding another mouth will not be an easy job for her. Even though Bamiche understood why her aunt did this, she often wondered why she never paid her a visit ever since then. Even if she ate her so much, why would she abandon her without a bother about what the Bassis might do to her? She was happy when the Bassis took her in, as she believed it was a chance for a fresh start and a chance to be part of a real family again. But life in the Bassis household was not what Bamiche had imagined. From the beginning, Mrs. Bassi made it clear that Bamiche was not really a part of the family, while Rachel, Mrs. Bassi's biological daughter, was treated like a princess. Bamise was treated like an outsider, a burden. Rachel, a year younger than Bamise, was the apple of her parents' eyes. Her room was filled with toys, her wardrobe with pretty dresses, and her days were spent surrounded by friends and adoring relatives. On the other hand, Bamishe's world was a stark contrast. She sleeps at a cramped corner in the storeroom with a thin mat on the floor, a handful of hand-me-down clothes, and a constant feeling of loneliness. Many people believe that Bamishe was the boss's house help, and no one really paid attention to the poor girl. But then, despite the torment and mistreatment from Mrs. Bassi and her family, Bamishe worked hard at school. Even though it was a public school and she had to wear torn uniforms and worn-out shoes, it was the only place she felt somewhat safe. She would study for hours late at night after doing all the house chores without any help from Rachel. But Mrs. Bamishe always finds a way to make Bamishe miss school, hoping that she would fail her exams. She would pack a heap of clothes for Bamishe to wash, and she would do the laundry from very early in the morning up until when students came back from school. Then, when her teachers asked after her, Mrs. Bassi would lie that Bamishe deliberately did not come to school because she is a lazy girl. At first, the teachers believed Mrs. Bassi and they would discipline Bamishe, but at a point, they realized that Bamishe was a good child and Mrs. Bassi was simply a bad mother. The teachers were often surprised that Bamishe would always come top of her class at the end of every session, even though she doesn't go to school every day. Bamishe's teachers also noticed how quiet and reserved she was, but none of them ever suspected the extent of the horrors she faced at home every day, even though they know she has been treated unfairly by her foster mother. Bamishe excelled in her studies, hoping that one day education would be her way out. But the maltreatment got worse with each passing day, and at a point, Bamishe began to think of taking her life and ending it all since nobody loves her. One day, she refused to go home after school. Bamishe's plan was to wait until evening and jump into the flowing river close to her school. Our teacher, Mrs. Adeka, had some work to do before going home, so she left the school by late evening. She found Bamishe sitting under the tree. Bamishe greeted her without acting suspicious, but our teacher knew everything was not fine with her. She took a step back and asked Bamishe why she's sitting alone under the tree. I'm waiting for my friend, Bamishe answered, looking away. But her teacher knows that she doesn't have any friend as her classmates often make fun of her for wearing torn clothes and looking tattered. So she knew she was lying. What friend? Mrs. Adika asked, searching her eyes closely. Bamishe could not say anything as she looked away. Hot tears ran down her face and she quickly wiped it off the back of her hands. Mrs. Adeka was surprised. She asked Bamishe what was wrong, but Bamishe could not say anything. She kept crying as she bowed her head and placed her hands on her knee. Mrs. Adeka helped her get up and hugged her. Bamishe, I don't know why you're crying, but I want you to know that it's really safe to talk to me. Okay? You don't have to keep it all in. But Michelle raised up her head. She told Mrs. Adeka that she is not happy living with the Basses and she was waiting under the tree to jump into the river when the school was empty. Mrs. Adeka was shocked. She couldn't believe her ears. She wondered how much Bamishe had suffered for her to think of suicide. You're just 18 years old and you're already suicidal? Mrs. Adeka exclaimed, her voice shaking and tears building up in her eyes. After pacing for a few minutes, she held Bamishe by the hands and together they went to the principal's office. Mrs. Adeka reported Bamishe's abuse case to the principal and Bamishe also corroborated her story. The principal dismissed them and he promised Mrs. Adeka that he would address the situation. Mrs. Adeka left with Bamishe after counseling her for over 30 minutes. Bamishe felt much better and she thanked her teacher. The next day, the principal invited the Basis to school and he asked Bamishi to say exactly what she told him in their presence. Bamishi was surprised that the principal could ask her to do such a thing. She knows that the Basis would kill her if they ever find out that she went around telling people about her maltreatment. So, she feigned ignorance and told the principal that she doesn't understand what he wanted her to do. The principal explained everything she said to the Basis and added salt and sugar to the story. He said Bamise believes her foster parents were not caring enough and that she wants them to be arrested for maltreating her. Bamise was surprised because she never said this. It was Mrs. Adeka who brought up the idea of taking the matter to the human rights organization. As the principal talked, Bamise began to cry. When he was done talking, the Basis explained to the principal that Bamise is an ungrateful child who doesn't appreciate their kindness. Mrs. Bassey also said that Bamise steals from their pot of soup and lies at any given opportunity. Bamise cried as her foster parents lied against her. Her parents asked her if they were lying against her, but she quickly nodded to confirm that they were saying the truth. Bamise knows her foster parents would deal with her if she dare call them liars, especially in the presence of the principal. Mr. Bassi said he was tired and willing to let Bamise go back to her parents' family instead of trying to implicate them. But the principal begged on her behalf. He thanked them for taking care of her despite all her bad habits and encouraged them to continue, and God will bless them for it. They thanked the principal for inviting them and hearing their own side of the story, and even gave him some money for telling them what Bamise said. When the Bassis left, the principal asked Bamise if what her parents said were true. Why are you crying? Were they lying against you? But Bamise did not say anything. The principal then concluded that her parents were indeed saying the truth. He was surprised. He wondered why Bamise would lie against her foster parents, and he also did not bother to hear her out when she said she wanted to tell him something after a while. Later that day, the principal assembled all the students and he told everyone what Bamise did. He told them how she lied against her foster parents and even intended to arrest them when all they did was take great care of her. He disciplined Bamise at the front of the students and warned the other students against lying and parenting their parents badly. Bamise pleaded and kept screaming that it was all lies, but her pleas fell on dead eyes. Mrs. Adeka did not understand what was going on and she could not stop the principal from disciplining Bamise. She went to the principal's office later that day to ask him why he had to discipline her, but he replied that she better avoid Bamise because she is a thief and a liar. He explained everything the Bassi said about Bamise and how she did not deny any of it. Can you imagine? Bamise agreed to everything her foster parents said, and she even apologized to them for lying against them. In fact, her foster parents are tired of her mischievous ways, and they are even willing to take her back to her family. But Bamise begged them to forgive her. These kids can be funny. But Mrs. Adika did not believe anything the principal said, because she knows a lying child when she sees one. And the fact that Bamise would consider suicide is enough for her to trust her. However, there was nothing Mrs. Adeka could do about it because doing anything would mean she doesn't respect the principal's decision. So she let things be. Bamise got to the school the next day with different marks on her body. Mr. and Mrs. Bassi inflicted different injuries on her while disciplining her for telling the principal what goes on in their home. Mrs. Adeka felt bad for Bamise when she saw the bruises, but she couldn't do much because she doesn't want to lose her job. But she decided from that day that she would take care of Bamise. Mrs. Adeka monitored Bamise closely and she gave her lunch every day until she graduated from the school. Mrs. Adeka did everything to make Bamise happy while she's in school and Bamise was very grateful to her. As the years passed, the extent of the abuse became more apparent. As Bamise grew thin and frail, her immune system weakened by years of malnutrition and neglect. When she finished her secondary education, she hoped that Mrs. Bassey's treatment of her would improve, but things only grew worse. While Rachel was preparing to go to the university, the resentment towards Bamise only continued to grow. Mr. and Mrs. Bassey told Bamise that they did not have the resources to send her to a university. Bamise pleaded with the Basseys to please reconsider their decision because she really wants to go to a university, but the couple remained adamant. One day, Bamise's health took a turn for the worse. She developed a severe cough that wouldn't go away. Mrs. Bassey, of course, ignored her complaints. Even as Bamishe's condition worsened, Mrs. Bassey refused to take her to the doctor. "You better stop pretending to be sick and carry out your chores," Mrs. Bassey would tell Bamishe whenever she coughs. "I don't know why you always believe that your cunning behavior would work on me. No, it can't. I am not your dead mother or father who left you in this cruel world. If I don't take you in, who else will? You should be grateful, you lying devilish child." Mr. Bassey would add, supporting his wife without showing any form of empathy for Bamishe. Days passed and Bamishe's condition worsened, but nobody was interested in the poor girl. Rachel arrived from school one weekend to find Bamishe coughing seriously throughout the night. Her room shared a wall with Bamishe's own, and she could not sleep well because of the continuous cough from the stall where Bamishe sleeps. In anger, Rachel went to the tiny room and dragged Bamishe out by her hair. She asked her why she was disturbing her night's sleep with her cough, but Bamishe sobs as she replied that she has been sick for some weeks now and she doesn't have the money to get some drugs. She pleaded with Rachel to have mercy on her and give her some money for drugs, but Rachel replied that she would rather give her money to a homeless beggar than give it to Bamishe because she is simply a slave in their home. "Don't you ever ask me for such a favor in your lifetime again," Rachel roared as she went back to her room. She told Bamishe to sleep on the floor of the balcony and cough there for as long as she wanted. Bamishe was not surprised at Rachel's behavior and hurtful words, but the fact that none of the family members love her in any way breaks her heart. During all this time, Bamishe stayed home to do all the house chores. Mrs. Bassey stacked all the workers, and Bamishe took over the duties of every one of them. From cleaning to cooking and being a gardener, Mrs. Bassey ensured that Bamishe worked hard every day, with very little time to rest. One day, Bamishe collapsed on the road while she was running errands for Mrs. Bassey. She was burning with fever and it was too late for early intervention. A few good Samaritans saw Bamishe lying on the road that leads to their house. They asked her where she lives and she pointed to the Bassey's house. Someone rushed to inform Mrs. Bassey of what had happened to Bamishe, but by the time she got there, Bamishe had been given some first aid by some good Samaritans. "But you told me she collapsed." "Ah, there is nothing wrong with her now." "Bamishe, is anything wrong with you?" Mrs. Bassey asked nonchalantly. Bamishe could not speak loudly. She replied that she was fine, but the pharmacist from a nearby medicine store who gave her the first aid insisted that Bamishe must be taken to a hospital. "She doesn't look fine, madam. She is running serious temperature and you must take her to the hospital before her situation becomes worse." Mrs. Bassey argued with the pharmacist, asking her if she would be the one to pay her hospital bills, but the pharmacist replied that she would make sure that Mrs. Bassey is arrested if anything bad should happen to Bamishe. At this point, Mrs. Bassey reluctantly agreed. She knows that not agreeing with the pharmacist may put her in trouble if Bamishe should die. The pharmacist called an ambulance and Bamishe was rushed to the hospital. She was diagnosed with pneumonia. The doctor said that her years of malnutrition had severely weakened her and her chances of survival were slim without proper care. Mrs. Bassey, cold and detached, signed the necessary forms and left Bamishe in the hospital alone. She did not even stay to hear the doctor's full prognosis. In her mind, Bamishe was a burden that she was finally free of. Days passed and Bamishe lay on the hospital bed, fighting for her life. No one came to visit her, except for the pharmacist who fought for her to be taken to the hospital. Bamishe thanked her greatly for saving her life, but the pharmacist stopped visiting after a while because she was transferred to another hospital where she worked and it was too far for her to visit Bamishe. But she kept in touch on the phone and called her regularly. Bamishe was lonely and her recovering process was not easy. She has overheard nurses on many occasions talking about how Mrs. Bassey had not even asked about her condition since she was admitted. They all assumed Bamishe would soon be transferred to the morgue, but against all odds, Bamishe survived. The hospital staff were astonished. Bamishe's recovery was slow and difficult, but her will to live was stronger than anyone had expected. A nurse named Mrs. Agnes, who had been particularly moved by Bamishe's story, began visiting her regularly, bringing her small gifts and words of encouragement. Sister Agnes saw in Bamishe a strength that reminded her of other children she had cared for who had been through similar traumas. She could not bear to think of Bamise returning to the Bamise's household. She was very happy that Bamise was finally out of the hospital, and through her connections, Sister Agnes found the couple who had been looking to adopt. They were kind, compassionate people who had always wanted children but were unable to have any of their own. After hearing Bamishi's story, they immediately expressed interest in meeting her. When Bamishi was finally discharged from the hospital, she was greeted by her new family, the Adikas. It was a surreal experience for her. For the first time in her life, she felt wanted. When she met the family, she was shocked because it was her teacher and her husband. They brought her to their home, a warm, inviting place with a bed just for her, food on the table, and smiles all around. Bamishe could not believe a new reality, but she was very happy that it was a teacher who ended up adopting her. Even though she has known Mrs. Adeka for a long time, it took her time to earn her trust. But with patience and love, Bamishe slowly began to heal, not just physically but emotionally. Mrs. Adeka would often tell Bamishe to feel free and talk to her about anything. Bamishe, I want you to know that we would never adopt a child we wouldn't love like our own. It is one of the reasons why it took us so long to make the decision. We want a child that we love, and in truth, we were drawn to you immediately we saw you. So, do not doubt our love for you. Be free and let us know what you need at any point in time. Bamishi was happy as she began to experience pure love from the wonderful couple. They took her on a shopping spree to change all her clothes and shoes. Then she was registered in a tutorial center in preparation for her university education like she has always wanted. She also had the luxury of being with friends from her tutorial as long as she doesn't come home late at night, and she could dish her food without fear of being scrutinized. Even though she took time to adjust, Bamishi was delighted for her new reality. This was what she has always wanted, a good family with lots of love and peace. And just like an answered prayer, God handed them to her exactly when she needed them during her weakest moments. Meanwhile, back in the Bassey's household, things were falling apart. Rachel, who had always been the center of her mother's world, had started hanging out with the wrong crowd at her university. She began experimenting with drugs, first out of curiosity, then as an escape from the pressures of her mother's expectations. The once perfect daughter that Mrs. Bassey had cherished was now spiraling out of control. Mrs. Bassey, in her arrogance, believed she could fix this. Unknown to her, Rachel's addiction had taken root deep inside her. The drugs became her escape, a way of numbing the pain of living in a world where she was expected to be flawless. One night, after an especially heavy binge, Rachel overdosed, and by the time Mrs. Bassey found out, it was already too late. Mr. and Mrs. Bassey were heartbroken as Rachel's death shattered them. They had lost their precious daughter, and now in their grief, they were forced to confront the reality of their actions. They remembered that Bamishi was at the hospital, and they decided to pay her a visit and bring her home. But when they got there, they were informed that Bamishi had been taken away by another family. The Bassis were enraged to hear this, and they threatened to sue the hospital. But when they were shown the series of calls and emails sent to them without a response, they calmed down. The hospital accused them of being cruel and negligent and undeserving of a kind-hearted and intelligent soul like Bamishi. In anger, the hospital director sent them out of his office and warned them never to come back again. The Bassis left the hospital, regretting their actions, and they wished they had treated Bamishi like their own child. Bamishi, the girl they had abandoned, had survived, while Rachel, the daughter they had loved and spoiled, was gone. Bamishi, now living a peaceful life with a new family, heard the news of Rachel's death but felt no satisfaction. Instead, she mourned for Rachel, recognizing that they had both been victims of Mr. and Mrs. Bassey's cruelty in different ways. Bamishi knew that while Rachel had been privileged in material things, she had also been trapped by the weight of her parents' unrealistic expectations. In time, Bamishi found healing and purpose. She pursued her education and became a social worker dedicated to helping children like herself, those who had been neglected, abused, and forgotten. She had learned through her suffering that resilience and love could change a life, and she made it her mission to be there for abandoned children. As for Mr. and Mrs. Bassey, they lived out the rest of their days in loneliness and isolation, haunted by the daughter they had lost and the foster child they had discarded. The weight of their choices became their constant companion, a burden they could never escape. Bamise, however, had found a freedom. She had survived the years of pain and in the end she triumphed, not by seeking revenge, but by building a life filled with the love and kindness she had always deserved. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, leave a comment and like to enjoy more interesting stories from my channel. Have a nice day. Bye.